Hey everybody, Joshua Snow here, and welcome back to another edition of the Art of Landscape Photography. If you're new to my videos, you will come to find that I am anything but consistent. It has been approximately 5 months since my last video, and today I want to hop right back into it with a Lightroom tutorial on how to make your images pop using localized adjustments. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, so we have this beautiful image taken from Glacier National Park at a place called Hidden Lake. This was on a very atmospheric day. It had been raining for a couple of days, but there were also some wildfires in the area and in other states that were blowing through here. So it's a very hazy, very smoky scene. This is along the trail that takes you down to the lake. This is beyond the boardwalk where most people stop. Usually this area is absolutely full of flowers. This is after a couple of weeks of hosting workshops in the area. And most of the flowers had been tattered by rain and wind or hail in some cases, and they just weren't great. So shift of focus, and rather than kind of capitalizing on the wildflowers that are usually abundant in the area, I thought it'd be really cool to kind of showcase some of the geology in the area. In this case, these glacially scarred, humongous slabs of rock. And you can see other colors of different types of rocks in the background and further in the midground. And that's one of my favorite parts about this area. It really feels very, very wild and very, very ancient. So I am going to show you how I would just kind of do some basic global adjustments, and then we're going to get into using more localized adjustments to really bring out some depth, balance the image out, and create something a lot more three-dimensional than you see here. So let's get right into it. First, you might notice that my Lightroom is set up a little bit differently. I have customized this layout to use the things that I like to use and only what I like to use in the order I like to use them, getting rid of things that I might not use, including some of the other modules that are in here in Lightroom. So to start, we're just going to do a profile correction. Now, typically I will not do a vignette or distortion correction. I kind of like the way that the wide angle lens distorts the image just kind of naturally. So we're going to leave that alone, but I really want to make sure that I've removed chromatic aberration. Now, this isn't necessarily the type of scene where a lot of chromatic aberration is going to be evident or visible, but it's never a bad thing to make sure that that is removed. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of come down here to basic. Now, this is a very dynamic file. You can see that it stretches almost entirely across the histogram up here. So I really just kind of want to reduce these highlights, bring out some more detail in those shadows, and then lift the deepest, darkest blacks to really kind of bring the ambiance back into the image. It was not this dark. I feel like there was a lot more glowing light kind of hitting the highlights of everything, and you'll kind of see why when I reduce these highlights here in a second. But the first thing I want to do is just kind of bring down exposure. And this might seem counterintuitive because a lot of the image is very dark, and you can see I'm already very close to clipping. But I don't want to completely rely on highlights to bring down the brightness of the sky. So rather than do that, we can kind of meet in the middle a little bit by using some negative exposure. And then I'm going to rely a little bit more on the highlights. And the reason that is, I'll get into in another video in more detail, but if you've ever seen weird glowing light along your horizon lines or edges, it almost look like a halo but glowier. Typically, that's from reducing the highlights too much and lifting the shadows too much, i.e. global adjustments. So I don't want to do very extreme adjustments to the image as a whole. That is what makes images feel very flat and less dimensional. So I want to do things more on a localized adjustment type basis. And that's where we're going to use some of our gradients and different tools and masks to create more depth. But while we're still here in the global editing bay, we're just going to go ahead and lift up these blacks. You can see on the very bottom left, there were some yellow pixels indicating that we're very, very close to clipping. And I want a nice, soft, ethereal, kind of dreamy feeling at the end of this edit. So I want to make sure that those are nice and bright and open. Maybe we'll lift our shadows a little bit more. just to get a little bit more balanced and make all of the details a little bit more visible. Okay, the next thing we're going to do here is add a little tiny bit of texture, just because we have quote unquote flatten the image a little bit by doing some of the balancing work that we've done. So by adding a little bit of texture, we're kind of bringing a little bit of structure back to those details. So we're going to go ahead and just add a little bit of texture. And then once we've kind of done this, this is where I like to start playing with the profiles. Now, you might immediately start with kind of playing around with some of the profiles, but I like to at least get the image slightly balanced and maybe a little bit neutral before I do start playing with those color profiles, just so I get a little bit better idea for the saturation and the direction of the image. So we're going to go ahead and click on these 4 little squares here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at some of the different profiles. I like to look at the Adobe ones, and I think just based on my first couple go rounds with this image, we're going to kind of aim for this landscape version here. Now, whenever you've got wildfire smoke, a lot of times you're going to have a strange white balance. It can have sort of a cyan aqua quality at times, where at other times it can have a very warm pink peachy sort of color casts. But all of that can be dealt with adjustments and some color balancing and some white balance adjustments. So we're going to keep moving here. Now that we've selected a profile that gave us a little bit more base saturation, it opened things up a little bit more than previously, and this gives us a really good base canvas for doing some of our localized adjustments. So the very first thing that I want to do here is attempt to make a selection of everything beyond this ridge and this tree line. I feel like the mountain and the distant ridge and the clouds all have a lot more potential for more detail and more contrast. And just to help bring that all down, we need to make a large selection of that area. And so I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that I can see what we're working with. I like to zoom out a little bit so that I can really see the image as a whole. And the first thing I want to do is grab a linear gradient. And we're going to kind of just pull that down until it's encompassing pretty much everything up to that ridge. And of course, we've over selected, so we need to do a little bit of cleanup. And this is where some of the really nice new Lightroom tools are going to come in really handy. So we're going to go ahead and subtract objects. And it's kind of a mixed bag for me, the results that I get from using either the brush selection tool or the rectangular selection tool, but I feel like they each have their place. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean by that right now. So I'm going to use the rectangular selection tool to sort of remove any of this effect from these trees kind of up here in the front here. And you can see that it did a partially good job. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of keep working at this until I've gotten those kind of removed from that selection, and that's getting a little bit better. Let's go ahead and try the brush selection tool just so you can kind of see a little bit of a difference. I feel like with trees like this, it's going to give you a better result. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to keep kind of painting over those little areas here. Come over here to this tree, and we'll just kind of follow the edge here. Create a little bit of a transition here. These trees over here, and then we're going to let everything beyond that point just kind of fade out with the gradient. Okay, it's struggling big time. This is Lightroom is getting more and more powerful, but it is still a far cry from some of the abilities that you have in Photoshop. So if you're still really worried about and intimidated about Photoshop, don't be. It's time to learn and kind of take things to the next level. Okay, we're going to keep it going. Got a couple areas over here that did not do a good job. Okay. Sometimes we just have to suffer through the masking bit, but it is worth it in the end. Okay, you can see that that did not what we wanted it to. It really over selected. So let's just go ahead and take a look at what we want to do here. We're going to start by just reducing a little bit of the exposure. And then we can go ahead for the highlights and we can just kind of bring those down a little bit. And that's going to help show some of this warm yellow light that's breaking through these clouds, or trying to break through these clouds, creating this beautiful glow. We've got some of that warm orange over here and over here as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and create another mask, and this one's just going to be a linear gradient. And we're just going to kind of bring it down to where it's covering most of the sky, almost down to the horizon. If it encapsulates a little bit of this ridge, I don't think that's a problem. We're going to go ahead and just kind of reduce this a little bit more, see a little bit more detail in those clouds. We're going to bring up the contrast a little bit. We can even bring up the clarity a little bit. And we're going to kind of layer several of these so that we really get a nice feathered effect that compounds at the top of the image, giving us a really nice vignette kind of effect. So linear gradient as well. And this time, you know, each one of them might be slightly different. Again, we're just kind of layering them on top of each other to really build that effect up at the top of the image here. So that's looking great so far. It's really brought out a lot of that drama, a lot of that texture. Let's go ahead and just see what it looked like without any of these masks. Yes, so far, so good. So let's go ahead and create another mask here. We're going to kind of create a radial gradient. And this radial gradient is going to try to bring in a little bit more of the light that's kind of breaking through here and hitting some of the highlights in this foreground. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to expand this to kind of cover the whole foreground. And then we're actually going to do a subtraction of another radial gradient. And you'll see why in a second here. This is going to kind of fade this front edge so that it doesn't hit too much of this area, because that would technically be in shadow. We don't necessarily want to brighten this area too much. So now we can go ahead and bring up exposure a little bit here. We can bring up shadows a bit. We can bring up whites a bit. Oop, that might have been a little bit too much. My Lightroom is lagging a little bit. There we go. Let's go ahead and take a look at that adjustment. Yeah, that's looking good so far. Now, the next thing I want to do is select these foreground rocks, or just create a bit of a vignette feeling down here in the bottom of the image as well. But this is going to do a few things. It's going to darken the bottom edge, kind of creating that vignette effect. It's going to increase contrast, and we're going to add a little bit of texture and clarity, which should make these feel a bit more three-dimensional. And so this is kind of the depth that we're talking about, where we want this foreground to feel a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more contrasty, a little bit more texture, and then everything that is far away is going to feel a little bit softer, a little bit more ethereal, and that is really going to help kind of amplify that dimensionality. Okay, the next thing I want to do is bring up a little bit more of the color and texture within these boulders. So I'm going to actually select objects, and I'm going to try with the rectangular selection tool to select these boulders. I'm going to start right here on the edge of the frame, and we'll see what kind of job this does. Okay, it didn't do a terrible job. I don't necessarily want the green in between the rocks selected, and I don't necessarily want the rocks beyond it selected, but we can narrow this down by intersecting this mask with either a color range or a luminance range. In this case, I'm going to choose color range, and although you cannot see it, if we click under show overlay so that we can actually see what we're working on, we can then click on this reddish color. And you can see that did a pretty good job. We've got a couple of areas where it didn't select that well that actually has some of that color. So if we hold shift, we can actually add to that selection to make it a little bit more broad. But we also run the risk of over selecting. So that did a pretty darn good job. If you needed to refine that, you have this great slider up here where you can reduce the amount of colors that are being affected by that selection. So we had some of those greens selected, and if I pull this slider down, you'll see that those greens really start to filter out so that we're only really affecting the reds in that rock. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to pull down exposure a little bit, and I'm going to pull up saturation. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of white and pull down the blacks as well, and that will help increase the saturation even more. And so you can see that that really brought out a lot of that color. Okay, let's go ahead and use a few more localized adjustments to bring out a little bit more detail in this ridge, in the side of this mountain, and then maybe do a few creative effects like enhancing some of this fog, enhancing some of the glow. But for now, I'm then going to intersect this once again, except this time it's a luminance range. And so we need to familiarize ourselves a little bit with this luminance range and understand it a little bit better and how it works. The left side is pure black. The right side is pure white, similar to our histogram. And so if we want to target the darks, then we need to remove the lights from this intersection. So we need to go to the right-hand side of this slider, and we need to start bringing it down. Now, this slider has a little bit of nuance here where it actually splits into two. So if you look here, if we adjust this back to 0 and we grab here, you'll see that that slider separates. And this is important because this allows us to create a very soft, very feathered transition between our tonal values. And so if we want to immediately remove a known tonal value from our selection, then we can start by bringing down this main slider point here, and then we can grab the edge, and then we can start feathering it. I kind of want this isolated to the darker parts of this mountain and to this ridge. And we're going to go ahead and that looks pretty darn good. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a bit of dehaze. We're going to add a bit of clarity. We're going to add a bit of texture. We're going to add a bit of contrast. And then we are going to balance out the color temperature. We're going to kind of neutralize some of the blue cyan color that was being amplified there by the contrast adjustment and the dehaze adjustment. The smoke this night was very thick. And so the combination of the warm light penetrating the clouds and the strange color of the smoke really created some interesting color challenges here. But this is going to give us a little bit of a leg up on the color balance that we will deal with once we've kind of gotten some of these localized adjustments dialed in a little bit better. And so this is looking really good so far. I think we need to do a little bit more to kind of bring out some of the really great details that are going on in this scene. So I think I want to bring out a little bit more clouds in that sky. So I want to just try the select sky adjustment and see what it does. I think it's going to have a hard time around the left horizon. It did, but it's not the worst. It's not the worst selection. So I think we can work with this. We're going to go ahead and we're just going to pull down exposure a little bit more, and then I think that's going to be good for kind of a global sky adjustment. And I want to do a few more of these linear gradients intersected with tonal values so that we can do a little bit of, I'll call pseudo dodge and burning. And so we're going to start by pulling a gradient down. We're going to intersect this with a select sky function here. Intersect with select sky so that it doesn't spill over into our mountain and into our ridge here. And then we're going to also intersect this with a luminance range like we did previously. Now this time we want to target the darker parts of these clouds. So again, we're going to go ahead and start dragging down from the right. And then we're going to split this slider out. There we go. We're just trying to target the darker clouds here to create some more contrast and separation and more depth in those clouds. So we're going to go ahead and just maybe pull exposure down, and then we'll make another linear gradient. And this one is going to be targeted toward the highlights. Okay, once again, we are going to intersect with a select sky selection. And then we are going to intersect with a luminance range. Unlike previously, we're going to grab the left side of this slider, which is going to start removing the darker tones from the sky. Okay, now we're going to split this slider so that we get a nice feathered transition. We might have to take this up a little bit more. All right, now we can lift exposure. Great. All right, the next thing I want to do is do some kind of effects with using some of these localized adjustments. So first thing we're going to do is grab a radial gradient, and I'm going to kind of expand it over this little ridge down here. It's kind of a plateau before it drops off again down toward the lake. I'm going to expand this till it's almost out of frame, and we're going to go down here to dehaze. We're going to lift up on that, and then we're going to lift up on the blacks, which is going to just act like a bit of a haze, almost like fog. Okay, now I want to take another radial gradient, and I want to sort of encompass this beautiful glowing light breaking through here. And this time I want to intersect with another luminance range and possibly color range. Let's see how the luminance range works for this. And we can add a really nice feathered edge to that adjustment. There we go. Now we're going to go ahead and add a bit of warmth. Maybe increase the whites a little bit. You can see we're a long way from overexposing. So I have some room here to really intensify this light without really risking overexposing. So we're just going to add a little bit of warmth to that and a little bit of brightness to really help show that light breaking through. And now we have an opportunity here to kind of create a bit of a glow over here breaking through on this side of the mountain. So I'm going to go ahead and grab another radial gradient. And we're going to make this a little bit oversized. Okay, now I want to go ahead and subtract as much of the mountain as possible, but I'm going to use a brush here with a nice feathered edge and just kind of do this manually because I want this light to kind of wrap around the side of the mountain here and not completely remove it from the mountain, and then maybe a little bit up into the cloud. So you can see I'm just kind of keeping the feathered edge of my brush within the zone that I'm trying to affect so that it's not going to remove it entirely by putting the center of my brush over the area I'm trying to paint. There we go. So you can see we got a really nice soft feather there in the clouds, and then we got a nice glow here. And I can now kind of do a similar thing that I did with the fog, where we use a little bit of negative dehaze, a little bit of increased blacks, except I'm going to add some warps to this to tie it together with the light that's breaking through on the other side, and maybe even push the whites here to intensify it a little bit. We might even be able to go back over our initial layer of fog down here with another radial gradient to kind of compound that effect. Let's just see what a little bit of extra fog looks like down in that area. And if you don't want to necessarily brighten it, you can always reduce exposure. You're really just looking for a haze here. That's looking really solid. Now the overall image already has a bit of a color balance going on. We've got some very, very subtle blues and some very, very subtle warm tones. And so we don't necessarily need to worry about enhancing the color balance or the color harmony, but maybe just neutralizing a little bit of the middle tone warmth. And I think that'll help just kind of neutralize it a little bit rather than feel like it has a color cast. So I'm going to grab another linear gradient, and we're just going to kind of encompass the entire foreground, and maybe we'll expand this so that it's a bit more feathered, and we're just going to go ahead and add a little bit of cool white balance here. Okay, now that is looking really good so far, and I want to go ahead and move on to a little bit of cleanup. We're going to go ahead and visualize spots. I know that I have a few dust spots, and we're going to go to the heal tool, and we're just going to clean up this one dust spot that was really driving me nuts. And so now we can go back to our global adjustments, and we're going to come down here to calibration, and we're going to just do a little bit of increased saturation on our blue channel here. I just really like what that does to the image when you have a very subtle saturation throughout. And then we're going to go ahead, we're going to take this hue slider, and we're going to just back it off a little bit. And then this slider, the shadow tint slider, is a very powerful tool. And if you are experiencing a pinkish color cast or a greenish color cast, this can really, really help. And so if we dial this in to the left a little bit, it's just helping neutralize that color cast a little bit more. That is how I bring an image to life and create a little bit more dimensionality in Lightroom. Thank you guys so much for watching that video. If you'd like to learn more or join me on a photo tour or workshop, or even book just a private digital darkroom session, head on over to wildlightexposures.com. Thanks guys. See you on the next one.